Gates is not the only big, very interesting pick that we got yesterday. Let's go ahead and put A1C up on the screen. Tulsi Gabbard has been tapped to serve as Trump's director of national intelligence. Of course, Tulsi was previously a Democrat, previously very critical of Trump and his foreign policy. She said famously, like, being Saudi Arabia's bitch is not America first. A tweet which apparently is still up to this day, Emily, which is kind of an incredible statement in and of itself.
Did she at Kushner?
I think it was implied. It was a subtweet.
Amazing.
Yeah, so anyway, she's going to be Director of National Intelligence. She also had, there was some indication that she was herself being surveilled under the Biden administration when she was moving through airports. She was like being tracked, et cetera. So what do you make of this particular pick?
Well, I think it's really fascinating that it's likely now we'll have, because recess appointment's a great example, or the reason why. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard is someone who would actually have a hard time with Senate confirmation, and we may see that happen, and we may see a recess appointment in this case. But
yeah,
to have her and Marco Rubio side by side, I mean, just take both of them on Syria. Just like go back and look at how both of them handled the question of Syria.
That's right.
It is their foreign policies distilled into this like perfect contrast. They are so incredibly different from one another that it's amazing to think this is, I mean, DNI is not a joke. Like, that's a very serious position. It's a powerful position. Obviously, the same will be said of Secretary of State. So that those two will have those clashing viewpoints, I think a lot of regular Americans will say that's really good. The other possibilities is a total mess. It's just a total disaster because nobody can get on the same page. Our allies and enemies are hearing different things from different people, and nothing is clear. So again, like, maybe there's something good that comes from it. I can't think of a modern precedent for having that polarized viewpoints in such high-profile positions in such a way that it's your worldview, not just like a policy difference on Syria, for example, but like Syria is a representation of how, I mean, Marco Rubio is an old-school Cold Warrior who has had a shift towards realism, but I wouldn't call him a realist.
No.
He's had a shift towards realism. He didn't vote for the Ukraine aid package that was in the spring, but as some people have pointed out, he really kind of hemmed and hawed about why he didn't vote for it, and there were a lot of different reasons that he gave. He's been fairly supportive of Ukraine. He recently called the war a stalemate. Says it needs to come to an end, so at least that's something. But on Latin America, he's like old school Cold Warrior. He obviously was very supportive of older policies in the Middle East, as was Pete Hegseth, by the way, although he seems to have, as Dan Caldwell at Concerned Vets, who worked with him at Concerned Vets, has said, he shifted. I think Marco Rubio has shifted less than a lot of people on the right.
Am I remembering this correctly, like just a couple months ago, Tulsi say that Marco Rubio would be a disastrous pick?
In July. She did an interview on Megyn Kelly's show on July 10th and said this would be a really bad sign and a big mistake.
Yeah, I mean, Marco Rubio, like by any reasonable standard, is a neocon. Like, I think there's, and Sagar made this point, I think this is an important point. Like, it's one thing for people at this moment, given how clear the issue is on the Republican side of the ledger, to pull back with regard to Ukraine. It's another thing to have been, correct from the beginning on things like the Iraq War, on Afghanistan. And, the other thing is that Trump himself, there's no indication he is anti-war, even as it's possible, and even this is really not clear, that he may take a different approach on Ukraine. But like I said, even that is not totally clear because he has been on both sides of that issue as well, and has at time hit Joe Biden from the hawkish end of saying, like, you're not doing enough for the Ukrainians. But it's more that, some of the critics of the Ukraine war, they're more interested in, hey, we need to keep our powder dry so that we can potentially go to war with China. None of these individuals, Tulsi included, Tulsi has completely shifted her position with regard to Israel. She used to be critical, and now she's completely on board with whatever Israel wants to do. Otherwise, I don't think she would be in this particular position, dare I say, given that AIPAC seems to have had a lot of influence, whether overt or covert. They've had a lot of influence in terms of the foreign policy related picks in particular.
His ambassador to Israel is Mike Huckabee. So, I mean, it would be hard for Tulsi Gabbard to have her old positions on Israel.
Yes, and Hegseth is equally as sort of messianic and has this very religiously driven view of Israel.
Yeah.
And this is quite unprecedented. I mean, obviously our foreign policy has always been lockstep with Israel, et cetera, et cetera. But, Huckabee is the type where it's not just the Biden administration sort of like agreed with Yoav Gallant, who was also, in my view, like a maniac and said that Palestinians like are animals, et cetera, et cetera. But he was at least interested in, hey, how do we get our own hostages back? Huckabee and Hegseth are more in line with like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich that are like, we need to just end this problem once and for all, take over the West Bank. Like, this is, you know, our religious fulfillment of religious prophecy. And they're all sort of like weirdly on the same page with that. So it does represent a shift in that regard. We'll move on to, we'll talk a little bit more about Rubio, but one thing I was thinking about both with regard to the quote unquote deep state and with regard to the Department of Justice is, you know, Trump, the way he portrays these type of picks is like, I'm going to make sure that justice is done and that it's not weaponized, et cetera. That's not actually what he wants. He wants it to be weaponized the way he wants it to be weaponized. That was true in the first administration. I think it'll be even more true now. And, you know, he's been pretty upfront about that. It's the same thing with things like surveillance, which falls under the Tulsi Gabard DNI, where it's not that he's opposed to mass surveillance. It's not that he's opposed to censorship. It's that he wants it to be applied to his enemies. So, you know, things like surveilling any sort of left movement, racial justice, you know, economic justice, certainly the pro-Palestine movement, like any, you know, resurgent like Black Lives Matter movement, anything like that, he would be totally cool, if not affirmatively in support of the type of surveillance that's been weaponized against all kinds of activist groups across the board. And we've already seen his positions with regard to censorship. I mean, he wants to deport anyone who is pro-Palestine. He wants flag burning to be banned. The list goes on and on. So it's not like he's actually pro-First Amendment. He just wants speech restrictions to be applied in the way that serves him and goes against his own political enemies. So I think that's the other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about the powers at DNI. You know,
and there's some Republicans who are really strong on free speech and consistent, you know, like Thomas Massey.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hopefully Tulsi Gabbard, but I mean, I think it's an open question. And Rand Paul, but you need one of them. You know what I mean? Like, it's so easy for the others to slip into, this is anti-Semitic speech. Of course it must be surveilled, or of course it's anti-Semitic. It must be connected to foreign terrorist groups. So of course it falls under this umbrella, or it goes into this category of something we have to surveil. So it's very, very easy for even people who are like anti-establishment Republicans to slip into that.
That's right.
I mean, I think that is also a huge unanswered question. And I'm optimistic about Tulsi Gabbard. I'm one of the, like, I still have faith in Tulsi, but we'll see.
Yeah, we will. I mean, the reason I don't is because she's just totally flipped her position on so many issues with no explanation for it. And so, you know, to me, it just seems like she made a calculation that her path to having more notoriety, influence, power, et cetera, was just to come on board with Trump and whatever that entailed. And hey, she played her cards right. Worked out for her.
I'd rather have a Trump administration with Tulsi Gabbard and Marco Rubio than, and I like Marco Rubio, honestly, but than just Marco Rubio. You know what I mean? Like, it just makes me more comfortable as an American that there's at least some divergence on really critical issues. And yes, I think Gabbard has changed her mind on some key things, but some of those have been, I mean, I just don't have a sense that maybe other than Israel, she's had a fundamental shift in her worldview on foreign policy in a way that would put her in line with a Marco Rubio. So I think we could be in for some really interesting disagreements in the Trump administration.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how this all plays out. It is definitely going to be interesting. We've referenced this already. We could put A2 up on the screen. Marco Rubio, it is official in for Secretary of State. Emily, what happened here? Because this got reported, and there was kind of a freak out on the MAGA side because he is a neocon. And, you know, Lil Marco, Trump himself, had very critical words of him to say in the past about how he'd be Sheldon Adelson's puppet, et cetera, how far we've come from those days. Anyway, there was a delay in the release of this name on the Trump side there was some suggestion that like, oh, you know, Tucker was flying down to talk to him, and there was this whole coalescing of all these people who were going to try to talk him out of putting Marco Rubio in state. But ultimately, Marco Rubio is in state. So what do you make of all of that? What can you say about that?
I mean, I think it was, so the Rubio people were really confident from the beginning. So I think they, and someone was confident, obviously, enough to leak it to Maggie Haberman.
Right.
But that said, even after it's leaked to the New York Times, there's a series of days where Donald Trump makes all of these other major announcements, and of people who are much less orthodox picks than a senator. You know, Pete Hegseth is a good example.
Right.
And Marco Rubio comes, Wednesday night, Wednesday evening, somewhere around there. I mean, yeah, I think there was an effort to thwart it among people. You know, people can probably guess who they are. If you remember when Dave Smith tweeted something like, the battle against Mike Pompeo is good, but like we have to make sure there are no neocons in this administration. Donald Trump Jr. quote tweeted that and said, agree 100, I'm on it.
100.
Yeah, I'm on it. And so I think, you know, you could probably read into what happened over the series of days. There were some leaks that it was coming from Rick Grenell's camp. Rick Grenell obviously would have wanted a position similar to that, and he doesn't have anything so far. Not DNI, not CIA. Those were all things that he was talked about for, not DOD, any of those. Like, it just didn't happen for Rick Grenell, and I think there probably was. Rick Grenell said he wasn't the one leaking negative things about Marco Rubio, but
that doesn't mean that it wasn't people in his camp.
It doesn't mean it wasn't people in his camp, and it doesn't mean actually that whether they were in his camp or not, it doesn't mean that, you know, maybe somebody like Donald Trump Jr. or Tucker Carlson weren't lobbying really hard for basically anyone but Marco Rubio, or John Bolton, obviously, but basically anyone other than Marco Rubio, because they see him as a pretty, like, that's a holdover from the previous Republican Party on foreign policy.
Right. And so the fact that he gets chosen anyway, in spite of that kind of relatively organized effort to block him, what do you think that indicates about who has influence?
Yeah, I mean, I think that tells you exactly what's going to happen in this administration. That, you know, and
you read into that Susie Wiles, or
Susie Wiles, probably Susie Wiles. Susie Wiles, by the way, is has been affiliated with Mercury, which is like the swampiest lobbying firm in D.C.
We're talking pharma, like all the bad guys.
And it was who Paul Manafort was lobbying for when he was lobbying on behalf of the Party of Regions in Ukraine. He was doing it through Mercury, and so. There's just a lot of, I think, donor class baggage that comes with La Savita and Susie Wiles. And I wonder, actually, if the announcement of Tulsi as DNI, which came out either right before or right after Rubio, maybe right after the Rubio announcement, was part of that push and pull with Don Jr., Tucker Carlson, and others saying, like, okay.
Well, at least throw us a bone here, basically.
Throw us a bone, right, yeah. So I kind of wonder if that's what happened in all of the infighting, because what was happening over the course of this week, like, I had a source who was very knowledgeable about the transition who said the Trump people don't fully trust Tulsi Gabbard. Ryan and I talked about this yesterday. That's not Trump himself, but Trump world doesn't fully trust Tulsi Gabbard. And so she was kind of on the chopping block. Rubio, I think, absolutely was on the chopping block. Just it seemed like Trump was pretty set on the pick, but there was still intense fighting among, like, Don Jr. and others. So I don't know if Rubio, maybe this is an interesting part of the story, if Rubio indicated that his foreign policy was shifting more than maybe publicly we've seen his foreign policy shift in a way that made them feel comfortable, but it's hard to imagine. I mean, those guys are aligned basically with the Tulsi Gabbard ideology. And I don't know how Rubio could have indicated anything to them that would say he was really in that category.
Yeah, and the thing is, with Trump, if he actually takes like an interest in something and has a clear ideological position, everyone's going to fall in line with whatever it is he wants. It's just that he doesn't always have, and then it becomes, okay, well, what are the voices in the room saying? What are the options that are being presented? And we've seen him be very, kind of malleable in the past based on who happens to be around him, et cetera, on something that isn't core. So in any case, that was, to me, that was an interesting indication of the way some of these intra-MAGA battles are playing out. And when Susie Wiles was first named chief of staff, I was a little bit surprised by that, to be honest with you, but I also was surprised that there wasn't concern over that in MAGA world, because the thought was like, oh, she's just an apparatchik, she's just not ideological. There's no such thing. In this town, there's no such thing as non-ideological. Non-ideological basically defaults to like whatever the sort of mainstream conventional wisdom is, you know. And so I think perhaps her fingerprints and her influence seems to be on some of these picks. But also, you know, Trump is a big boy and makes up his own mind. And I always get irritated when people are like, oh, it's the fault of this person, it's the fault of that person. It's like, this is the man that was elected president of the United States. He's had years to think about who he wants in these positions. He's making up his own mind. So, you know, he also deserves like direct blame, credit, however you want to look at it, for the picks that he is ultimately putting forward. Rubio is certainly another one in the, you know, Miriam Adelson, very pleased with this pick as well. He's been extremely aggressive and hawkish, you know, on the side of Israel. There was a report Michael Tracy tweeted out, Israeli media apparently, quote unquote, dancing the hora in Netanyahu's office over Trump filling his administration with, quote, old school Republicans. Not exactly music to the ears of people like Tucker Carlson or Dave Smith et al. Let's go ahead and take a listen to a little bit of that.
And going back to Mike Wagenheim, Mike, just in the past hour, the Trump team confirming the pick of Mike Waltz as the national security advisor. And I don't want to exaggerate and say that Israel, the government here, and its supporters are breathing a sigh of relief over these picks. But certainly, I think some of the concerns they had about the next administration have been eased by picking certainly these three, and especially Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, people who have, for example, spoken with I-24 News just in recent months about their strong support of Israel and their concerns over Iran.
Not just breathing a sigh of relief, Colin. They're dancing the hora right now at the Prime Minister's office with these selections by Donald Trump. I mean, we were expecting some isolationists possibly in those positions, or maybe some who lean at least a little bit toward Trump's new foreign policy and the MAGA foreign policy. Hasn't been that case at all. I mean, Rubio and Mike Waltz are in the mold of old school Republicans on policy, both pro-Israel stalwarts to the hilt. They'll challenge anybody who views the situation otherwise. I mean, you couldn't have selected two better picks, I think, if you're sitting in the Prime Minister's office right now. And Elise Stefanik will be a firebrand at the United Nations. She already told Isaac Herzog in a meeting this morning that she'll have Israel's back there. And we didn't expect otherwise, but always good to hear that if you're within the Israeli government in a very problematic institution like the UN. By the way, Marco Rubio told us last Tuesday at Donald Trump's watch party on election night that he would, with the Republicans taking over the Senate, not knowing then that he would be nominated likely for Secretary of State, he said that the Republican Senate should take up defunding more UN agencies that he feels are either in cahoots with Hamas or turn a blind eye to those terror organizations that operate in Gaza and elsewhere.
So Miriam definitely getting our money's worth with, you know, a cabinet that is quite Israel first. So, and the...
Was he trying to sabotage them? You couldn't have scripted that in a way that would, like, actually piss off MAGA
it
more.
Just kept getting worse.
He was like... They just,
like, none of that MAGA foreign policy here. Old school Republican.
Old school Republican. He's like, yeah, they're totally from the old school Republican mold. Like, very, very reassuring.
Yeah. Yep. Well, there you go. Miriam Adelson gave him $100 million, and there were quite a few other donors in that camp, the Bill Ackmans of the world, whatever, who, you know, wanted a certain thing from the foreign policy team, and they certainly got it. Well, they certainly got it.
And it's also just, Marco Rubio surrounds himself with people who actually are genuinely more realist. He's obviously been new right on populist economics, so just being in that category means that his milieu is more new right than it is old right. So, and he's, you know, had some kind of, he said some interesting things about Ukraine that have indicated, as we were talking about before, a possible shift. But clearly, if that were more evident, if there was much more of a shift, you would not see that.
Yeah. The other thing that's worth noting too, and then we'll move on to the Senate stuff, but and this will be a good transition to that. Rubio is one of the more interesting people in economics. He's more, you know, in terms of economics, he is more clearly in that new right camp, as of course is J.D. Vance. Neither one of them will be in the Senate anymore, leaving very few remaining there. that have anything other than kind of like old school doctrinaire Republican views.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's another significance of pulling him out of that role and putting him into the role where his ideology is the worst.
Yeah, there's some people who are, on the new right in particular, who are now really starting to worry about the Senate because Rubio and Vance were very, very key in that new coalition of, at least on the economic front, especially on the economic front. So.
Gotcha. All right, let's talk about the Senate. Put A4 up on the screen. So MAGA's choice, Trump's choice, Tucker Carlson's choice was Rick Scott, and he got third in terms of Senate majority vote. It was a secret vote. John Thune ultimately wins with 23 votes. Cornyn got second with 15. Rick Scott comes in third at 13. I'm quite sure if this was not a secret ballot, the results would be very different. But break down some of these dynamics for us, Emily.
Yeah, so this was, and Ryan and I talked about this yesterday as the vote was happening.
Right.
Which is just like, it was a mess. I mean, this entire process has been a mess, but Rick Scott for years has been laying the groundwork essentially to step into the vacuum, knowing that McConnell was ailing, which is another thing that was kind of kept quiet for a long time. I was talking to someone last night who works on the Hill and takes pictures on the Hill and was saying basically that McConnell doesn't like to be photographed in his wheelchair.
Wow.
And he is often in a wheelchair now. So a lot of people in the Senate knew that this was coming. And Rick Scott saw that, started laying the groundwork for it. Cornyn and Thune are big McConnell allies. So MAGA world, Donald Trump Jr. tweeted, I mean, this was like a year ago, maybe less than a year ago, we cannot let Cornyn and Thune take over the Senate after Mitch McConnell leaves. Like, he flat out said that. And now, obviously, John Thune has won this race. So conservatives got behind the Rick Scott bid. Like, MAGA people got behind the Rick Scott bid because Rick Scott agreed with Mike Lee that they needed to do some of these procedural changes to the way the Senate worked. Some of that was like pulling back Harry Reid's centralization of power, which people could debate the inside baseball Senate mechanisms, but it was that. It was also just like, come out with a clear plan for your policy goals every year, like some fairly unobjectionable things, but that Republican leadership is hesitant to do because they don't want to be bossed around by the what did John McCain say, the cuckoo birds? So, remember this was back in 2014, the Ted Cruz, Mike Lee, and Rand Paul.
Yeah.
They don't want to be bossed around by people like that. They want to do what they want to do. And so Rick Scott became the very problematic figurehead of what I think is a good movement. Because Rick Scott has all kinds of corporate baggage. He has all kinds of, he's just not a charming spokesman.
He's like a Medicare fraudster.
Yep, and not a charming spokesman at all.
Right.
He doesn't make deals. He's not one of those people. Even there's some MAGA people who you can hate the swamp and you can still be good at operating. You can still be good at actually negotiating.
Yeah.
Rick Scott is not seen as one of those people at all, and for good reason. He's sort of prickly.
Yeah.
And so everyone gets behind Rick Scott. But knowing that Rick Scott doesn't have a shot in hell because people don't really like him that much, MAGA conservatives started to work on John Cornyn and started to try to get concessions out of John Cornyn and say, all right, Cornyn, you know that you need us. So why don't you just say, or why don't you just give us a little bit of these procedural differences? He became a Kevin McCarthy figure. That's how Kevin McCarthy became speaker, sort of giving a little to the Freedom Caucus.
Right.
That's what Mike Lee was asking for. And Cornyn went along with it. Cornyn lost. And it was obviously, they're sort of splitting the vote between Scott and Cornyn. So I think most people didn't want John Thune, but one of my sources who was working on this gave a pretty good quote yesterday when I asked basically what happened. How did Thune edge out Cornyn and Scott? This source said, quote, handing out committee assignments like candy and activating K Street. The conference has been clear. This person said that they want reforms and expect them. John Thune did not win by an overwhelming margin. He's edged out Cornyn by 5 votes. He has a mandate, but barely. He's going to have to shake up the status quo to retain the trust of the conference. So we will see if John Thune feels that pressure and gives in to some of these things like having 4 weeks of debate before an omnibus, which I think everyone should say, yeah, that's great. 4 weeks of debate before we spend billions of dollars in all of these different ways. That sounds good. I wouldn't be super optimistic that he'll do that, though.
Yeah. I mean, from Trump's perspective, I think he just wanted someone who he felt would be guaranteed to do what he wants them to do.
Yeah.
And he
absolutely.
felt the most confident that Rick Scott would be that person. And again, like, you know, to try to parse the ideology is a waste of time in a lot of ways, because on ideologically, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think the three of these guys have much ideological difference. I mean, Rick Scott is not on the new right. You know, he put out the Republican policy priorities for the midterm elections that were like a disaster for them because it called for sunsetting every single federal government program, including Social Security and Medicare, every, 3 years or something like that. Yeah. And it was an albatross around the necks of Republicans. I mean, he's a standard issue Reagan type conservative as far as economics go, as are all three of these. So I think it was more about, for Trump, you know, which one do I feel the most confident is going to be the most loyal to me? My guess, looking from the outside at how all of this is going to go, is that Trump has such a hold on the party now and has such a clear track record of punishing anyone who crosses him that probably John Thune is going to do whatever Trump wants him to do when Trump decides to wade into these debates. And I think that's the part that maybe separates the three of them, is that Trump doesn't always wade into these, so there's a lot you can do behind the scenes that he's not really paying that close attention to. And perhaps that's where the difference comes. But on anything that actually is important to Donald Trump, like all three, and the indication to me is all three of these men, immediately when Trump was like, I want recess appointments, were like, no problem, we'll do recess appointments, which again is handing a gigantic part of their power over to the executive branch.
Although one point that I think is interesting, just as a hypothetical to test, is what does John Thune do when Donald Trump, if Donald Trump, we don't know this yet because we don't know much about what he would actually do when it comes to Ukraine, but when Donald Trump wants to pair Ukraine funding to a border thing that won't get through, or when Donald Trump wants to actually force Ukraine to the table and the aid becomes conditional or something like that, John Thune is a McConnell ally. He is, and Mitch McConnell's still in the Senate, and Mitch McConnell is tied into the donor class that is deeply, 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 deeply supportive of Zelensky and Ukraine, and that is their red line. And I think it's a pretty interesting hypothetical. I agree that I think John Thune will go along with a lot of the Trump agenda, but there are certain things that are such red lines for the donor class. We don't know if Trump will test those boundaries, but if he does, I actually wonder what would happen. I don't know, because John Thune is so deeply enmeshed in K Street, the donor class, McConnell world, the old school Republican Party, and their red lines are so bright. Let's say Donald Trump decides to do something heterodox on Ukraine. Maybe he would do something weird on Israel. Maybe Tulsi Gabbard does something that they find objectionable. These are all just random hypotheticals. And if they happened, I don't know that Thune might put up a fight because he's just so entangled with McConnell world. So we'll see. But I think generally, I agree that he'll be pretty, what's the best word? Compliant.
Yes. Pliable. Yes. All right, let's also, we don't have to play this up, but it is worth noting, this is A5, you don't have to play it though, that he did say he's gonna keep the filibuster in place. We'll see if that maintains, but that's the current positioning. I imagine there may be some pressure to get rid of that, but there's also a lot of mechanisms you can use, like budget reconciliation, that allows you to get through what you want using majority vote. You know, Democrats did some of that when they were in office, but they also would be like, oh, the parliamentarians said we couldn't do blah, blah, blah. Yeah. I don't think that the Republicans will have that same like, oh, the rules, the parliamentarian ruled, we can't do. So there's still a lot they can get done with a 53-seat majority. They're
pushing reconciliation right away. Yeah. Like that has to be first 100 days, pass the priorities through reconciliation, border priorities, like put it all in there.
Yeah.
So that'll definitely happen.
Absolutely. The other thing that David Sirota, always with his eye on the ball, you guys should be subscribing to Lever News because they do great work. I don't care where you are on the ideological spectrum. Put this up on the screen. Thune is like an actual lobbyist. I feel like like that was his profession before he was in the Senate. Yeah, he was a lobbyist. And Sirota says, less than 2 years after the East Palestine disaster, Republicans have now made their new leader a former railroad lobbyist who helped block rail safety legislation. So he is a swamp creature. I don't think there is any denying that.
He was the problem on that J.D. Vance Sherrod Brown bill. John Thune was a hugely problematic. What's the phrase? Gumming up the works. Yeah. For that bill.
Gotcha. The other thing, last piece, and then we'll get to Trump's meeting with Biden, is this is indicative of how I think most of this is going to operate on the Hill, whether it's people who were at some point adversarial to different Donald Trump priorities. Trump has cemented his full control of this party. Congressman Troy Nehls had a memorable quote about this. Let's take a listen.
There's no question he's the leader of our party. So now he's got a mission statement, his mission, and his goals and objectives, whatever that is, we need to embrace it. All of it. Every single word. If Donald Trump says jump 3 feet high and scratch your head, we all jump 3 feet high and scratch our heads.
Okay.
Sure. I mean, that's
whatever his goals are. Doesn't matter.
It's what a lot of the MAGA base wants. It's exactly what the MAGA base wants to hear. And it's a great reminder that there is no MAGA without Donald Trump, meaning he is the ideology. And, normally what you would say is whatever, is, what the Tea Party wants, that's what we want. It's different when you're saying when this one individual wants. That's what we want. He is the ideology of MAGA.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And so it's a very honest statement. And while others would have too much shame to say it quite as overtly as this gentleman did, that is the operating sentiment among the vast majority of the Republican Party at this point.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.